a shattered beer bottle on a rain-soaked Chicago sidewalk, and a 74-year-old woman in a thin nightgown standing barefoot in the freezing November dark, calling out for a son who didn't know she was gone. When a 27-year-old delivery girl on a beaten-up bicycle threw herself between a confused, wandering old woman and a violent drunk swinging a broken bottle at her head, she wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just the only person on that street who refused to look away. She didn't know the trembling woman she was shielding was the mother of one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. She didn't know he was standing 15 feet behind her, watching a stranger bleed for the one person on earth he couldn't live without. And she had absolutely no idea that her 3 seconds of reckless courage would pull her into a world of blood money, ruthless loyalty, and a man so powerful he could have bought the entire block they were standing on, yet so broken he hadn't held his own 4-year-old son in over a year. What Conrad Vale did next didn't just change Finley Marsh's life, it shattered every rule he'd built his empire on, because for the first time in 4 years, the most feared man in the city owed a debt he couldn't repay with money. If this story of unlikely courage, impossible love, and the moment a mafia boss discovered that the bravest person he'd ever met was a girl who had nothing but a cracked phone and a heart that refused to quit, already has your attention, do us a favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs a powerful story tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the bitter cold streets of Chicago's South Loop, November 2023, and the night everything changed. But before we can understand what happened on that sidewalk that night, we need to understand who Conrad Vale was, because the man kneeling on the rain-soaked pavement with trembling hands was not the kind of man anyone in Chicago wanted to meet in the dark. 2 hours before that moment, Conrad was standing on the 43rd floor of a glass tower, looking down over the Chicago skyline, and he wasn't admiring the view. In front of him, a man named Paulie Greco was kneeling on the concrete floor, blood leaking from the corner of his mouth, both hands bound behind his back with plastic zip ties. Paulie had stolen $300,000 from a shipment moving through the South Port, and worse than that, he thought Conrad wouldn't find out. The room was so silent that every broken breath from Paulie could be heard, along with the steady hum of the heater and the sound of ice melting in the glass of whiskey on the table that no one was drinking. Conrad didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't need to do any of those things. He only looked at Paulie with eyes as gray as the Chicago sky in November, then said 2 words to Priest Calloway, the man of 40 who always dressed in black and stood 3 steps behind him. Priest nodded. That was all. No one in the room asked where Paulie would be taken, because when Conrad Vale said those 2 words to Priest, the answer was always the same. Conrad Vale was 37, heir to the Vale family's underworld empire from his father, who had died in his sickbed 12 years earlier, and left his only son a network stretching from the commercial harbor to the basements that Chicago police pretended they didn't know existed. People called him the Iron King, not because he was more brutal than the others, but because he was colder. He didn't get angry, didn't lose control, didn't let emotion touch any decision he made. He had once known how to feel, 4 years earlier, when Renee was still alive. Renee, the only woman who had ever made Conrad Vale laugh for no reason, was shot dead in the underground parking garage of their apartment building one March evening, just after she had placed their son, Cash, not yet 1 year old, into the car seat in the back. 2 bullets. One in the chest, one in the throat. Cash wasn't hurt. The boy sat in his car seat, crying himself raw beside his mother for 47 minutes before Priest found them. Conrad didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't cry when the police closed the case for lack of evidence. He simply closed every door inside himself, one by one, until there was nothing left behind them but darkness and silence. From that night on, Conrad became a machine. He ran his empire with a razor-cold mind, protected his territory with strategy instead of gunfire, and built a wall around himself that no one, not even his own son, could touch. The black SUV brought Conrad back to the mansion in Lincoln Park at nearly 11 o'clock at night. The house was more than 700 square meters, all limestone and glass, and from the outside it looked more like a fortress than a home. Conrad walked through the second-floor hallway, his Oxford shoes striking evenly against the oak floor, then stopped in front of a door left slightly open. Inside, beneath the pale yellow glow of the nightlight, Cash lay curled on the bed, both arms wrapped tightly around an old, worn, green-stuffed dinosaur. That dinosaur was the only thing left from Renee. She had bought it 3 weeks before she died, placed it in Cash's crib, and said it would guard their son's sleep when his mother wasn't beside him. Cash didn't remember his mother. He had been less than 1 year old when she died. But Mrs. Dunn, the 58-year-old housekeeper who had been with the Vale family for more than 20 years, told him every night that the dinosaur was a gift from the person who loved him most in the world. Conrad stood outside the door, watching his son sleep. The boy had his mother's curls and his father's gray eyes, and every time Conrad looked at that face, he saw the two things he loved most, and the thing he had lost most, painfully existing together in one human being of 4. He wanted to go in, wanted to sit on the edge of the bed, stroke his son's hair, say something ordinary fathers said, but in his mind, a cold voice was always reminding him that everything he loved became a target, and Renee was the proof. Light footsteps sounded behind him. Mrs. Dunn appeared, holding the glass of warm milk she had meant to bring in for Cash. She looked at Conrad, then into the room, then back at him with old eyes that missed nothing. "The boy asked for his father all day," she said softly, her voice carrying no accusation, which somehow made it sadder than accusation. "Today he drew a picture. 2 people, one big and one small, holding hands. He said it was him and his father going to the park." Conrad didn't answer. He looked into the room for 3 more seconds, then walked away down the dark hallway, his shadow stretching across the wooden floor like a cut. Mrs. Dunny watched him go, sighed, then stepped into Cash's room, set the glass of milk on the bedside table, and pulled the blanket up to the chest of the sleeping boy, whose arms were still wrapped tightly around his mother's dinosaur. While Conrad Vale stood in the dark hallway watching his son sleep without daring to step inside, on the other side of the city, a 27-year-old girl was riding her bicycle through the November rain and praying that her cracked screen phone wouldn't die before she finished her last delivery. Finley Marsh had delivered 13 orders that night, from 7 o'clock in the evening until nearly 11 o'clock now, and the 14th order was flashing on the app screen with the words she hated most: "Deliver within 15 minutes or lose the tip." Her bicycle was old, with a heavy iron frame, the chain rattling every time she pedaled uphill, the seat wrapped in black tape because the leather cover had torn back in the summer. She wore a thin plastic raincoat bought at a dollar store, the kind that let rain seep through the shoulders after about 20 minutes, and the only sneakers she owned had been soaked through since the 3rd order. But Finley didn't stop, because every order was $7. Every $7 was 1 pill for her mother, and if she stopped, that equation would collapse. 8 years earlier, when Finley was 19, her father died. Thomas Marsh was an accountant, a gentle man with plastic-framed glasses, who taught Finley how to read a balance sheet before he taught her how to read novels. He was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer in the spring and died in the fall of the same year, so quickly that Finley hadn't even had time to understand what was happening before he was lying in a coffin. Her father's health insurance was the cheapest kind, the kind where the fine print was longer than the main contract. And when everything was finally calculated, the Marsh family owed $94,000 in medical bills. Finley was 19, a first-year nursing student at a community college, and suddenly she wasn't a student anymore. She was a debtor. 2 years later, when Finley was 21, her mother, Gloria, suffered a stroke. The doctor said prolonged stress, and the fact that Gloria had skipped her blood pressure medicine for months because she couldn't afford it had caused a blood vessel in her brain to burst while she was sleeping. Gloria survived, but the right side of her body was paralyzed. She lost the ability to speak clearly, and she needed long-term care in a nursing home. More debt piled on top of debt. Finley quit nursing school for good the week Gloria entered the nursing home, and from that point on, she never looked back. She worked 3 jobs: delivery through the app from 7 o'clock in the evening to 1 o'clock in the morning, kitchen help at a diner in Pilsen from 5 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock before noon, and office cleaning for a janitorial company in the Loop from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening. She slept 4 hours a day, ate whatever the diner had left over, and showered in the locker room of the office building because the room she rented in Bridgeport hadn't had hot water since September. Every night, no matter how exhausted she was, Finley video called Gloria before her mother went to sleep. Gloria couldn't say much. The right side of her mouth didn't move, but she always tried to smile with the other half when she saw her daughter's face on the screen. Finley would say, "Tomorrow I'm off. I'll come brush your hair, okay?" And Gloria would nod, her eyes lighting up for one brief second. Finley said that sentence every night. She hadn't had a day off in 7 months. Tonight, just after Finley finished delivering the 13th order to a high-rise apartment in the West Loop, where the recipient opened the door with a blank face, took the $45 bag of food without looking at her, didn't say thank you, and closed the door, leaving no tip. Her phone vibrated. It wasn't a new order. It was a phone number Finley knew by heart, because it called every week, Warren Briggs. Briggs was a loan shark, the creditor who had bought part of the Marsh family's hospital debt after the hospital sold its bad debt to a third party. And from then on, Briggs clung to Finley like a leech. She knew she shouldn't answer, but her hand picked up on its own, because the last time she hadn't answered, Briggs had called the nursing home directly to ask about Gloria's payment status. Briggs's voice on the other end was sweet in the way only professional debt collectors could be. "Miss Marsh, I'm calling to remind you that you have 30 days left. If I don't receive payment, I'll file for personal bankruptcy proceedings against you. Your bank account will be frozen, and when you can no longer pay the nursing home fees, Gloria will be transferred to a public facility." "Do you know what a public facility looks like, Miss Marsh?" Finley knew. She had visited a public facility when she was looking for a place for her mother. The smell of urine in the hallway, 2 nurses for 60 patients, and empty eyes staring up at the ceiling all day. She held her breath, bit her lip until she tasted blood, then said, "I'll pay, Mr. Briggs. I need more time." Briggs laughed softly and hung up. Finley stood on the wet sidewalk, rain running down her face and mixing with something warmer from the corners of her eyes. She turned off the phone, wiped her face with the back of her hand, then climbed onto the old bicycle and pedaled toward the 14th order, because $7 was $7, and her mother needed her to survive one more night. While Finley Marsh was riding through the rain to earn $7 for the next order, at the Lincoln Park mansion, another woman was fighting a battle of her own, only she no longer knew what she was fighting against. Vivian Vale was 74 years old, and if you had met her 10 years earlier, you would have understood why people called her the Queen of the Vale family. She was the woman who had stood beside her husband for 40 years, in a world where one mistake could be paid for with a life, and she had never once blinked. When her husband was dying in his sickbed, he didn't hand the empire to Conrad. He handed it to Vivienne, and only then did Vivienne hand it to her son, when she believed he had grown cold enough to survive. But Alzheimer's didn't care how strong you used to be. It came slowly, quietly, beginning with small things, like forgetting where the keys had been left, forgetting the name of a new maid, then moving on to larger things, like forgetting that her daughter-in-law was dead, forgetting that her son was 37 years old, and not 10. Now, on her bad days, Vivian looked at Mrs. Dunn and called her Renee, asking her daughter-in-law why she hadn't brought her grandson to visit today. On days worse than that, she didn't recognize her own bedroom, cried, and asked why people had locked her inside a stranger's house. And on the worst days of the worst days, she believed Conrad was still the laughing 10-year-old boy she remembered, and that little boy was waiting for her somewhere out there, alone, cold, and afraid. Those were the days she tried to get out of the house. Conrad had done everything money could buy. 3 specialized neurological nurses worked in shifts, 2 bodyguards stood watch, and the camera and door sensor system was connected straight to Priest's phone. But Alzheimer's wasn't an enemy Conrad could threaten, bribe, or destroy. It didn't obey systems, didn't fear bodyguards, didn't care about cameras. It only silently ate away at the mind of the strongest woman Conrad had ever known. And he had to stand there watching, unable to do anything. On that Saturday night in November, the same night Finley was riding her bicycle to deliver the 14th order, Mrs. Dunn sat in the armchair beside Vivian's bed and tried to keep her eyes open. She had been awake for 36 hours straight because the night nurse had called in sick. The replacement hadn't arrived yet, and Mrs. Dunn never left Vivian alone overnight. But the human body has limits, and at 10:45, Mrs. Dunn's head dropped against her chest. The book on her lap slipped to the floor, and she fell asleep. Vivian lay in bed, eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. In her mind, memory turned backward to the years of her son's boyhood, back when Conrad was just a 10-year-old child, and she used to take him to the Rosario restaurant on Wells Street every Saturday night for pasta. She remembered clearly, more clearly than anything in the present, that her son was sitting at their usual table, the one by the window, waiting for his mother. The Rosario restaurant had closed 15 years earlier, but in Vivian's mind, its lights were still on. She sat up, so gently that Mrs. Dunn didn't move at all. She stepped down from the bed, wearing no slippers, her bare feet against the cold wooden floor. She wore a thin cream silk nightgown, the kind she had bought back when she was still Vivian Vale and not an Alzheimer's patient. She walked through the hallway, past Cash's room, past the study Conrad never used, down the servants' back staircase, and reached the side door where the sensor system had just malfunctioned due to the severe storm interfering with the estate's external power grid. Vivian opened the door, and the November night struck her face like a slap. Rain, wind, cold cutting all the way to the bone, but she didn't turn back, because her son was waiting at the restaurant, and a mother never let her child wait. She stepped outside, barefoot on the stone path slick with rainwater, then onto the sidewalk, then disappeared into the darkness of Chicago. 23 minutes later, Mrs. Dunn jolted awake, looked at the empty bed, and her heart stopped for a beat. She rushed into the hallway, checked the bathroom, the kitchen, Cash's room, and every empty room was another knife. When she saw the side door standing open, rain blowing onto the tile floor, she shook so badly she had to brace herself against the wall to dial the phone. Conrad was sitting in the second-floor VIP room of the Iron Gate, the bar with an elegant front but the true headquarters of the Vale family behind it. When his phone vibrated, he looked at the screen, saw Mrs. Dunn's name, and something in his chest tightened before he could even answer. "She isn't in the house," Mrs. Dunn said, her voice breaking halfway through. The side door was open. The sensor didn't sound. "I don't know how long she's been gone. It's raining, and she isn't wearing shoes." Conrad stood up. The glass of whiskey on the table spilled over, and he didn't look at it. Priest was sitting across from him, and in 12 years of working for Conrad Vale, Priest had seen him face guns, betrayal, and the death of his wife, but never, not once, had Priest seen what was on Conrad's face now. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Pure fear. Raw and undiluted. The kind that only appears when the thing you might lose is something you can never replace. "Find her," Conrad said, and his voice, the voice the entire Chicago underworld was used to hearing cold as steel, broke for the first time halfway through. "Find my mother right now." Vivian had walked for nearly 20 minutes in the rain, barefoot on the freezing sidewalk, her thin nightgown clinging tightly to her body, and she didn't feel cold at all because inside her mind it was a warm Saturday evening from a lifetime ago, back when her young son was still waiting for her at Rosario. She turned into the South Loop by instinct, her old feet carrying her along a route she had once known by every street corner 30 years earlier. But 30 years had turned everything unfamiliar. Rosario was now a cheap bar with red and green neon signs flickering, loud rock music spilling out onto the sidewalk, and the sour smell of beer mixed with cigarette smoke rising from the wide-open door. Vivian stopped in front of the bar and looked inside with eyes searching for a 10-year-old boy among drunken faces, and her mouth called softly, "Conrad, sweetheart, I'm here." Tommy Boone stepped out of the bar at that exact moment, staggering, his right hand holding a beer bottle with 1/3 left in it, his eyes bloodshot, his denim jacket soaked by the rain. Tommy was 30 years old, unemployed for 7 months since being fired from a construction site for drinking on the job. And tonight he had drunk enough to turn everything around him into an enemy. Vivian, turning as she tried to find the entrance to a restaurant that no longer existed, slammed into Tommy's chest. The beer bottle flew from his hand onto the sidewalk, shattered, and beer and shards of glass splashed up his pant leg. Tommy looked down at the broken bottle, then looked up at the old woman in a nightgown who was stammering apologies in words that didn't fit together. And instead of seeing a sick, elderly woman who needed help, his drunkenness turned her into the person who had just destroyed the last thing keeping him calm. "Crazy old bitch, do you know how much that bottle cost?" Tommy roared, grabbing the collar of Vivian's nightgown and yanking her toward him. Vivian was terrified, her old eyes widening, and for the first time that night, reality leaked in through the fog of Alzheimer's. She didn't know where she was, didn't know who this man was, only knew that she was hurting and very afraid. She cried, her trembling voice calling her son's name as though that 10-year-old boy were somewhere nearby and would come running to save his mother. Tommy bent down, picked up the top half of the broken beer bottle, the neck with jagged glass edges, and raised it. "I'll teach you to watch where you're going." There were at least 4 people on the sidewalk that night. A couple walking in the opposite direction saw it, and the man pulled his girlfriend's hand to make her walk faster. A man smoking outside the bar looked up, then looked back down at his phone. And Finley Marsh was riding her bicycle past on the other side of the street, the empty delivery backpack on her back, having just finished the last order of the night. She heard the crying first, the crying of an old person, a fragile, helpless kind of sound, like the sound her mother had made during the first nights in the nursing home. Finley turned her head. Through the rain and the smeared neon light, she saw an old woman in a nightgown, barefoot, being grabbed by a man, and the man was raising something sharp high in the air. 4 people saw it. No one stopped. Finley didn't think. She didn't consider that she weighed less than 55 kilograms, that the man was twice her size, that she had no weapon, that this wasn't her business, that she still had a mother in a nursing home waiting for her to survive this night. She threw the bicycle aside, heard the iron frame slam against the pavement, and ran, cutting across 2 lanes of traffic as a taxi blared its horn and scraped past less than 1 step from her. She charged onto the sidewalk, shouted with every bit of breath left in her lungs, "Stop," then turned her back to Tommy Boone, wrapped both arms around Vivienne, pulled the old woman against her chest, and used her thin body as a shield between the old woman and the bottle. Tommy didn't stop. The momentum of drunkenness and anger had already gone beyond his reflexes. The broken beer bottle struck Finley's right temple with the full force of a man who weighed 90 kilograms. The sound wasn't like it was in the movies. It was short, dull, like someone smashing a melon against concrete. Finley felt a flash of white light tear across her vision, then pain. Pain so sharp the world tilted 45 degrees and her knees buckled. She fell, but her arms didn't let go of Vivienne. She pulled the old woman down with her, curling around her to shield her, blood running from her temple down her face, across her eye, across her mouth, and she tasted iron on her tongue. Vivienne cried in her arms, shaking all over, calling Conrad's name, and Finley, who had never met her, who didn't know her name, whispered in the voice she used every night when she video called her mother, "It's okay, ma'am. I'm here. No one's going to hit you anymore. I'm here." Tommy backed away 2 steps, looking at the blood on his hand, looking at the girl on the ground holding the old woman, and his drunkenness began to give way to something like fear. He turned as if to run. 90 seconds after Mrs. Dunn called, the black SUV screeched to a stop on South Michigan, and Conrad Vale stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped moving. He had ordered Priest to trace her through the traffic camera system the Vale organization had unofficial access to, and the signal had led him here, to this corner, to this bar. He ran, and Conrad Vale never ran, because running meant losing control. But he ran, and when he came close enough to see clearly, he stopped, as if someone had fired a bullet into his chest. His mother was lying on the wet sidewalk, her nightgown stained with mud, her silver hair spread across the pavement, and a girl he had never seen in his life, thin, wearing a cheap plastic raincoat, her face full of blood, was holding his mother, curled around her as if she were ready to take 10 more bottles before letting go. Finley heard the heavy footsteps, lifted her head, saw a tall shadow in a black suit standing over her, and all she could see through the curtain of blood and rain was another large man moving toward the old woman she was holding. She tightened her arms around Vivienne, her voice breaking as she said, "Please don't hit her. She's lost. She doesn't know where she is. Please leave her alone." Conrad knelt. Both knees of his $500 suit pants sank into the puddle and broken glass on the sidewalk, and he felt nothing except his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the night he held Renee in the parking garage 4 years earlier. "That's my mother," he said. And his voice was no longer the voice of the Iron King, no longer the voice that gave orders to Priest, no longer the voice that judged Polly Greco's fate. It was the voice of a son looking at his mother lying on the ground. "She's my mother." Finley looked at him, looked at the black SUV, looked at Priest stepping out from the driver's seat with a face cold enough to freeze water, and she understood that she had just stepped into a world that didn't belong to her, but she didn't let go of Vivienne. She held her until Conrad gently, so gently no one would have believed those hands had ever ordered things that couldn't be spoken aloud, lifted his mother from her arms. Priest had stopped Tommy Boone at the end of the street, one hand gripping his collar as lightly as picking up trash. Conrad looked at Tommy, and Priest, who had seen that look hundreds of times, knew that if Conrad said the word, Tommy Boone would never be found. But Conrad looked down at his own hand, at Finley's blood on his fingers, then looked at the girl lying on the sidewalk trying to push herself up, and he said to Priest, "Let him go. Tell him that if I ever see his face again in my life, he'll wish that beer bottle had hit his own head instead of hers." Priest released Tommy. Tommy ran into the dark, and no one in this story ever saw him again. Conrad turned back and knelt beside Finley. She was trying to stand, one hand braced against the bar wall, blood still running from her temple, her eyes losing focus and then finding it again, a clear sign of a concussion. She mumbled, "I'm fine. I have to go. My bicycle. I still have to." Then her knees buckled again and she fell forward. Conrad caught her before her face hit the ground. He lifted her in his arms, and she was so light that it made him angry. Angry that a girl this light had just taken a bottle to the head to protect someone she didn't even know. He placed Finley in the back seat beside Vivienne, who had been wrapped in Priest's coat around her shoulders. And he looked at Priest with eyes that needed no translation. "Call Dr. Yates," Conrad said, his voice having regained part of its steel, but only part. "Tell him to come to the house right now." The SUV tore into the Chicago night, and in the back seat, Finley Marsh lay unconscious with her head resting against Vivienne Vale's shoulder, her blood soaking into the woman's silk nightgown, and the most confused old woman in the world at that moment did something no one lost in dementia should have known how to do. She lifted her hand, trembling, and stroked the hair of the strange girl bleeding on her shoulder, her mouth whispering, "Good girl, sweetheart, Mommy's here, Mommy's here." Finley opened her eyes and didn't know where she was. The ceiling was higher than any room she had ever stepped into in her life. A crystal chandelier hung above her, casting a soft golden light, and she was lying on a bed whose sheets were so smooth that she thought she was lying on water. She tried to sit up, and the world tilted, a sharp pain tearing from her right temple down to the back of her neck, nausea rising into her throat, and she had to grip the side of the bed with both hands to keep from falling backward again. Her right hand touched her temple and felt bandages, the stiff medical cloth beneath her fingertips. She looked around. The large windows stretched from floor to ceiling, opening onto a view she had only ever seen in pictures. Lake Michigan glittering beneath the city lights, the Chicago skyline spreading far in the distance. The walls were covered in pale patterned wallpaper. A walnut bedside table held a vase of fresh flowers, and in the armchair beside the window, a woman with salt and pepper hair was sitting there, watching her with eyes that were both relieved and exhausted. "Don't move too quickly," the woman said, rising and stepping to the side of the bed, setting a glass of water on the bedside table. "My scalp was cut. The doctor gave you 7 stitches. Mild concussion. Needs monitoring for 24 hours. I'm Mrs. Dunn, the Vale family's housekeeper." Finley looked at her, looked at the room, looked at the silk sheet beneath her hand, and memory came crashing back. The beer bottle, the old woman, blood, the wet sidewalk, the man in the suit kneeling in the rain and saying, "That's my mother." "Is she?" Finley said, her voice hoarse. "The old woman from last night. Is she all right, Mrs.?" Dunn looked at her for a long moment before answering, and something in her eyes shifted subtly, from politeness into something almost like respect. "Mrs. Vivienne wasn't hurt. She's safe, sleeping in her room. Because of you." Finley breathed out, and then a second panic struck her at once. Not about the wound on her head, but about the thing flashing inside her mind. Her phone, the delivery app, the kitchen shift at 5 o'clock in the morning. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice suddenly urgent. Mrs. Dunn answered, "Almost 4 o'clock in the morning." Finley threw the blanket aside, her feet touching the cold wooden floor, her head spinning, but she gritted her teeth through it. "I have to go," she said. "I have a shift at 6 o'clock in the morning. If I miss this shift, they'll fire me. I need my phone, my bicycle. Where is it? I left it at." "Mrs." Dunn placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, in the way someone who had cared for the Vale family for 20 years knew how to keep a person still without giving an order. "You saved Mrs. Vivienne, Mrs." Dunn said, her voice never rising, but every word carried weight. "You put your own body in front of a beer bottle for an old woman you'd never met. In this house, that is worth more than any delivery shift in the world. You aren't going anywhere until the doctor says you can." Finley wanted to argue, but her head hurt so badly that she couldn't find words strong enough, and she sat back down on the edge of the bed, her hand clutching the silk sheet, feeling completely out of place in a room where one night probably cost more than 6 months of her rent. There was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Dunn opened it, and Conrad Vale stepped inside. He didn't look like the man Finley had seen on the sidewalk 90 minutes earlier. Or more exactly, he did look like him, only more ruined. His suit was wrinkled, his tie removed, the top 2 buttons of his shirt open. his hair slightly disordered because he had run his hands through it too many times, and the dark circles under his eyes said he had been awake all night. But his gray eyes were fully alert, sharp and heavy, looking at Finley with something she couldn't read. Not simple gratitude, something much more complicated, like a man trying to solve an equation whose answer didn't belong to any system he knew. Mrs. Dunn quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Conrad didn't sit. He stood about 3 steps from her bed, both hands at his sides, and silently looked at her for 10 full seconds before saying anything. Those 10 seconds stretched so long that Finley could hear the clock on the wall, the rain outside, and her own heart beating faster than normal. "Why did you do it?" Conrad asked. Not in the voice of a man giving an order, not in the voice of a man conducting an interrogation, but in the voice of someone who truly didn't understand, and needed to understand. "You didn't know who she was. You didn't know who I was. You weren't paid. No one asked you. There was no reason. That man was twice your size and holding a weapon. Why did you run in?" Finley looked at him, and she saw clearly that this question wasn't politeness. He was truly confused. He truly didn't understand why someone would risk her life for a stranger with nothing in return. That made her sadder than afraid, because she was an old woman in a nightgown in the middle of a rainy night, barefoot and crying, Finley said, her voice tired but not weak at all. And no one stopped. 4 people walked past and no one stopped. I couldn't be the 5th. Anyone with a conscience would have done the same. Conrad looked at her for another long moment, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't angry, wasn't mocking, only a flat statement that he knew to be true, because he had lived inside that truth for 37 years. "You're wrong," he said. "No one does that. I live in a world where no one does anything without calculation. Every kindness has a price. Every sacrifice comes with an invoice. And every person who steps into my life wants something. But you ran into the street, took a beer bottle to the head, for an old woman whose name you didn't know. So I'm asking again, why?" Finley looked at him. A 27-year-old girl who owed $94,000, slept 4 hours a day, wore a dollar store raincoat, looking straight into the eyes of the man the entire Chicago underworld didn't dare look straight at, and she spoke in a calm voice that carried more weight than any threat Conrad had ever heard. "Because if that were my mother lying on the sidewalk, I'd want someone to stop." Conrad didn't answer. He stood there for a few more seconds, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, the way a person does after seeing something he hadn't believed existed and needing time to process it. Then he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, and stood alone in the dark hallway for a long time, his back against the wall, his eyes lifted to the ceiling, and for the first time in 4 years, the wall he had built around himself had a crack in it. After leaving Finley's room, Conrad didn't go to sleep. He went straight down to the basement of the mansion, where Priest had turned the space into a sealed office with 3 computer monitors, 2 encrypted phones, and a safe whose code was known by only 2 people in the world. Conrad sat down in the chair across from Priest and said one single sentence. "I want to know everything about her before 6 o'clock in the morning." Priest didn't ask why. In 12 years of working for Conrad Vale, he never asked why. He simply did it. And Priest was better at this than any private detective or FBI agent, because Priest had something the FBI didn't have, the network of the underworld, people willing to open any database at 4 o'clock in the morning if the Vale family asked for it. By 5:45, Priest placed a thin file folder on the table in front of Conrad. Finley Marsh, 27 years old, born in Chicago. Father was Thomas Marsh, an accountant, died of lung cancer 8 years ago. Mother is Gloria Marsh, 55 years old, suffered a stroke 6 years ago, currently at Lakeview Nursing Home, a low-grade facility on the south side. Debt of $94,000, mostly medical bills. Part of it sold to a third-party debt collector, managed by Warren Briggs. Former nursing student at Harold Washington Community College. Completed 2 years. Dropped out when her mother was hospitalized. Currently working 3 jobs: night shift delivery app, morning kitchen assistant, afternoon office cleaner. No criminal record. No prior offenses. No connection to any organization, group, or individual in our system or anyone else's. Priest paused, then added, "No one hired her. No one sent her. She was just a girl riding by on a bicycle at the right moment." Conrad read the file twice. He lingered over the line about dropping out of nursing school and the line about Lakeview Nursing Home being a low-grade facility. He knew Lakeview. 2 years earlier, when he had been looking for care facilities for Vivian, he had visited Lakeview as part of the survey list, and he had left after less than 10 minutes, because the smell in the hallway had made him want to burn the entire building down. Finley's mother was lying there. The girl who rode through the rain delivering food every night so her mother could stay in the kind of place Conrad Vale couldn't endure for 10 minutes. He closed the file, looked out the window, where dawn had begun to break and the Chicago skyline was turning from black to gray, then spoke to Priest in a voice Priest recognized at once as the voice of decision, the kind of voice no one could argue with. I want to hire her to care for my mother. Full-time. Live-in. Priest didn't answer right away. He looked at Conrad with the cold eyes of a man who had spent 12 years protecting the Vale family by suspecting everyone, then said, I understand that she saved Mrs. Vivienne, but bringing an outsider into this house is a risk. Salerno has eyes everywhere. If he knows you've brought in a strange woman, he'll find a way to use it. Conrad looked at Priest. She bled for my mother, he said, not loudly, but every word landed like a nail being driven in. She was lying on the sidewalk holding my mother while I was sitting 15 minutes away drinking whiskey. I don't need her to be loyal. I need her here. Priest nodded once, and that was enough. 2 hours later, Conrad knocked on Finley's door. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, already changed into the clean clothes Mrs. Dunn had left ready for her, but she looked as if she were prepared to jump out the window at any second. The bandage on her temple looked stark white against her tangled brown hair. The shadows under her eyes were dark, but she was fully alert, and the wet sneakers she had asked Mrs. Dunn to retrieve were already on her feet, ready to walk away. Conrad entered the room, stood beside the window, and spoke directly, without circling around anything, because that was how he said everything. I have an offer for you. Become my mother's full-time caregiver. Live here. Salary 5 times your current total income from all 3 jobs. Full health insurance for you and for your mother. And your mother will be transferred to the best long-term care facility in Chicago. All expenses paid by me. Finley looked at him. She said nothing for 5 seconds, then 10. And Conrad saw that she wasn't surprised in the way he was used to seeing when he gave large numbers to other people. She didn't widen her eyes, didn't grab at it, didn't nod. Instead, her jaw tightened, and when she spoke, her voice was colder than Conrad's. No, I don't take pity money. I'm not a stray dog you picked up off the street because you felt sorry for me. I'm grateful that you took care of my injury, but now I need my bicycle and my phone, and I'll leave. Conrad didn't look offended. He didn't even blink, because in his world, obedient people were cheap, and people who said no to him were worth sitting down for. This isn't pity, he said. It's a contract. Business. My mother is 74 years old, with moderate-stage Alzheimer's. She needs someone with medical knowledge, and you have 2 years of nursing school. She needs someone with endless patience, because there will be nights when she calls you by the name of someone dead and doesn't remember who you are the next morning. And she needs someone brave enough to face all of that without running away. He paused. I've hired 11 caregivers for my mother in the past 3 years. None lasted more than 4 months. But last night, you took a beer bottle to the head for her without knowing who she was. You're the most suitable person I've ever met. Finley was silent. She looked down at her wet shoes, the only shoes she owned, and Conrad saw that she was thinking, not thinking about money or salary or insurance, but about something deeper, something he couldn't read. Then, she lifted her head, and in her eyes there was something he hadn't seen in anyone who had ever stepped into his life. It was caution, not fear, but the clear-eyed alertness of someone life had hit enough times to know there was no such thing as a free lunch. Who are you really? She asked, her voice not shaking but slowing down, her eyes holding his. This house, the cars, the bodyguards, a private doctor coming at 4 o'clock in the morning. You're not an ordinary businessman. Who are you? Conrad looked at her, and inside his mind, he weighed lying against telling the truth, a clean story against a dirty truth, then chose something in between, true enough to respect her, vague enough to protect her. I'm someone you shouldn't know, he said, and if you're smart, you'll take your bicycle, walk out the door, and forget you were ever here. But my mother needs you. And I pay my debts, always. The room went silent. Rain was still falling outside the window, the Chicago sky as gray as the eyes of the man standing before her. Finley thought of Gloria, thought of Lakeview nursing home, with the smell of urine in the hallway and 2 nurses for 60 patients, thought of Warren Briggs's call, 30 days, and the public facility where people went to be forgotten. thought of her mother's half-smile every night on the cracked phone screen. Then she thought of the old woman from the night before, those trembling hands stroking her hair in the back seat of the car, her voice whispering, "Mommy's here." And Finley understood that she wasn't only being offered a job. She was being offered the chance to care for another mother, a mother who was fading too, a mother who also needed someone who wouldn't walk away. She looked at Conrad Vale, the man she shouldn't know, and she said, "I'll accept, but I'm doing it for Mrs. Vivienne, not for your money. And if at any point I feel that something isn't right, I'll leave, and you won't stop me." Conrad nodded. "Fine. Mrs. Dunn will prepare a room for you." He walked out of the room, and when the door closed, Finley sat alone on the silk-sheeted bed, looking out at Lake Michigan as it turned from gray to silver beneath the morning light, and wondered what she had just stepped into. The first week was the hardest. Vivienne didn't recognize Finley, and she didn't want a stranger touching her. She pushed Finley's hand away when Finley helped her eat breakfast, turned her face away when Finley tried to talk to her, and twice she called Mrs. Dunn in and demanded that the strange girl be thrown out of the room. Mrs. Dunn looked at Finley with sympathy in her eyes but didn't say much beyond. Give her time. Finley gave her time. She didn't push, didn't rush, didn't act hurt when Vivienne rejected her. She simply sat in the chair beside the window in Vivienne's room every morning, bringing 1 cup of hot tea for Vivienne and 1 for herself, then sat quietly. Sometimes she sang softly, not any particular song, just the melodies she used to sing to Gloria when her mother had first been hospitalized and refused to eat, old songs Finley didn't remember learning from anywhere, though her hand tapped the rhythm on her thigh by itself. On the 5th day, Vivienne didn't turn her face away for the first time when Finley walked in. On the 7th day, she looked at Finley while Finley sang, and her eyes, those eyes that so often wandered into emptiness, suddenly stopped on Finley's face with focus. On the 9th day, Vivienne said to her, her voice soft and slightly confused, "You sing beautifully, Renee." Finley didn't correct her. She didn't say, "I'm not Renee," because she had cared for Gloria long enough to know that correcting a sick person when they were living inside their own memory was like yanking them out of the only place where they felt safe. She only smiled, took Vivienne's hand and said, "Thank you, Mom." From then on, the wall between them slowly disappeared. Vivienne began talking to Finley, sometimes calling her Renee, sometimes calling her daughter, and sometimes, in rare moments of clarity, she would look at Finley with eyes so bright it hurt and ask what her name was. "Finley," she answered. "Finley," Vivienne repeated, as if trying to remember, then smiled. A beautiful name. On the afternoons when Vivienne was most lucid, she told stories. She told stories about Chicago when she was young, about her husband, about the years when the Vale family built itself from nothing, and she told them with the quiet pride of a woman who knew she had stood behind every important decision without needing anyone to know. But she talked most about Conrad. "He used to laugh so much when he was little," she said one afternoon, her hand stroking the rim of her teacup. Her eyes turned toward the window, but seeing something 30 years away. Such a loud laugh, all day long, running through the house, shouting, making trouble. His father said he would never become a leader because he was too soft. But I knew he wasn't soft. He was only still allowed to be a child. She went silent for a while, then said, "Now he doesn't laugh anymore. Since Renee died, I haven't seen him laugh once. Sometimes I forget everything, but I remember that. I remember that my son forgot how to laugh." Finley didn't answer. She only held Vivienne's hand more tightly, because she didn't know what to say to a mother who was losing her memory, but remembered her greatest pain with perfect precision. There were bad nights. On the 2nd night of the 3rd week, Vivienne bolted upright at 2 o'clock in the morning, crying, calling her husband's name, pounding her hand against the wall, because she didn't recognize the bedroom where she had slept for 15 years. She said, "I want to go home. This isn't my home. Why are you people keeping me locked in here?" "Mrs. Dunn came running, but Vivienne shoved her away. Finley stepped in, not hurried, not panicked. She sat down on the floor beside the bed, where Vivienne was curled up, and said gently, "You're safe now. You're home. I'm here. I'm here." She said those words again and again, her voice steady and warm like a rocking rhythm, and slowly, slowly, Vivienne's hands stopped striking the wall, her breathing slowed, and she rested her head on Finley's shoulder, cried softly, then fell asleep. Finley sat there until morning, her back against the foot of the bed, Vivian leaning against her shoulder, and she didn't move, because she was afraid that if she shifted even a little, Vivian would lose this fragile moment of peace. Cash came during the second week. The boy didn't announce himself, didn't knock. He simply appeared suddenly in the doorway of Vivian's room one afternoon, holding Rex, his stuffed dinosaur, looking in with gray eyes like his father's, only wider and far less guarded. Finley was brushing Vivian's hair, and when she saw the boy, she didn't call him in, didn't wave. She only smiled, then kept brushing. Cash stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, then stepped inside, sat down on the rug beside Finley's chair, and didn't say a word. The next day, he came back. And the day after that, every afternoon, whenever Finley was in Vivian's room, Cash would appear, holding Rex, sit down on the rug, and stay silent. Finley didn't force him to speak. She only let him be there, and little by little, she began reading aloud, books about dinosaurs and adventures that she chose from the shelves in the study Conrad never used. She read to Vivienne, but Cash was the one who listened, his gray eyes wide, Rex forgotten in his lap when she reached the part where the T-Rex chased the explorer through the jungle. Then she taught him to draw. Then she taught him to fold origami, starting with simple things, a bird, a frog. And then the one Cash wanted most, a dinosaur. Finley folded a dinosaur out of newspaper, imperfect, a little crooked at the tail. But when she placed it in Cash's palm, the boy looked at it as if he were looking at a diamond. He carried it everywhere, placed it beside Rex on his pillow when he slept, and when Mrs. Dunn asked whether he wanted her to buy him a new toy, Cash shook his head and said, "I have Miss Finley's dinosaur now." The storm came at the end of the third week. Thunder cracked again and again over Lake Michigan. Gusts of wind shook the glass windows, and the whole mansion trembled in waves. Cash ran to Vivian's room at 11 o'clock at night, barefoot, clutching Rex, his face pale, his eyes red. Finley was sitting beside Vivian's bed reading, Vivian already fast asleep, and when she saw the boy standing in the doorway, trembling, she opened her arms without saying a word. Cash rushed into them, his hands grabbing her shirt, his face buried against her chest, and when the thunder exploded so close that lightning tore the darkness in the room apart, the boy whimpered softly and clung tighter. Finley held him, one hand stroking his curls, and said in the voice she had used for Vivian, for Gloria, for everyone she had ever loved in her life, "The storm will pass. Every storm stops eventually. Rex is here, I'm here, and nothing can touch you." Cash lifted his head, his eyes wet, and asked in a voice so small Finley had to bend down to hear it, "You'll stay, won't you?" Finley looked at the 4-year-old boy staring at her with eyes already used to adults disappearing, eyes no 4-year-old should have, and she held him tighter, saying, "I'll be here," and she believed it with everything she had in that moment, not knowing that promise would soon be tested down to the bone. The first conversation happened completely by accident. Finley went down to the kitchen at 1:45 in the morning to make a glass of warm milk for Vivienne, who had just woken for the second time that night and refused to go back to sleep without warm milk and honey, a habit Mrs. Dunn said Vivian had kept from 30 years earlier and that Alzheimer's hadn't erased. Finley stepped into the kitchen, turned on the small light above the stove, and saw Conrad sitting at the marble kitchen island, alone, in the dark, with an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him and a stack of documents he had stopped reading. He looked up when she came in, and both of them stood still, through one brief, awkward second, the kind of silence between two people who weren't used to sharing space at 2 o'clock in the morning. Finley said, "I'm making milk for Mrs. Vivian," then turned away, and that was the end of it. The second night, she came downstairs, and he was there again. She made the milk, he looked at the papers, and no one said anything. The third night was the same. On the fourth night, while Finley was waiting for the milk to warm on the stove, Conrad suddenly asked without looking up, "How is she?" Finley answered, "Better tonight. She only woke up once. She remembered my name, then went quiet." But the door had opened a crack. From then on, the conversations began, brief, cautious, like two wild animals scenting each other through a fence. Conrad asked about Vivian during the day, and Finley answered. Finley asked what Vivian liked to read so she could choose books, and Conrad answered. Safe questions, keeping distance, neither of them crossing the line. But in the fourth week, on a night when Vivian was sleeping peacefully, and Finley came down to the kitchen only because she couldn't sleep. She found Conrad staring at a sheet of paper with his jaw clenched, and she recognized that expression. It looked like her father's face on the nights when he sat at the kitchen table in their small Bridgeport apartment, wrestling with numbers that refused to add up to the answer he needed. She hadn't meant to ask, but her mouth moved faster than her mind. Financial trouble? Conrad looked up, and instead of closing off the way he usually did, he said, not out of trust, but because at 2 o'clock in the morning exhaustion made walls thin. A leveraged debt. A partner wants to restructure it in a way I don't like. But I haven't found the flaw in their proposal yet. He said it roughly that way, without details, without names, only the pure financial structure. Finley set the glass of milk down, sat across from him, and said, if it's leveraged debt with a high debt-to-equity ratio, then the weakness for the restructuring side is in the collateral guarantee, because in a leverage model, the party holding the original collateral always has veto power if the initial contract has an anti-dilution clause. She said it in an ordinary voice, as if she were reading a recipe, then took a sip of milk. Conrad looked at her. He couldn't hide his surprise, and for a man whose profession required him to hide every emotion, that was no small thing. Where did you learn that? My father, Finley said, her voice softening by one shade when she mentioned him. My father was an accountant. He taught me how to read a balance sheet before he taught me how to read words. He said his daughter needed to know where money went before she knew what money was. She paused and looked down at the glass of milk, but he couldn't read the fine print in his own insurance contract, and that killed him more slowly than cancer, but more certainly. Conrad was silent. He looked at the 27-year-old girl sitting in front of him, the delivery girl with calloused hands and a scar still on her head from the night on the sidewalk, who had just analyzed a leveraged debt structure more accurately than half the lawyers on his payroll, and he felt something inside the wall he had built over the last 4 years crack. Not loudly, not collapsing, only a small, thin crack, but enough for light to get through. He said nothing more that night, but the next night, he was in the kitchen again, staring at the darkened doorway, keeping himself still as he waited purely for the soft sound of her footsteps on the stairs. The next afternoon, Conrad was in the second-floor study, reading Priest's report on the week's activities, when the door was pushed open and Cash ran in, barefoot on the wooden floor, holding something made of paper high in the air. Look, Dad, the boy said, and his voice rang louder than any sound Conrad had heard in this house in months. Miss Finley made this for me. Cash placed the origami dinosaur on Conrad's desk, beside the stack of files and the 2 encrypted phones, and the little boy looked at his father with shining eyes, waiting. Conrad picked up the origami. It was small, made of newspaper, a little crooked at the tail, and it wasn't worth a penny in a world where everything he owned was measured in thousands of dollars. But he looked at the paper dinosaur and thought about Rex, the stuffed dinosaur on Cash's bed, the dinosaur Renee had bought 3 weeks before she died, the dinosaur she had placed in the crib and said would guard their son's sleep when his mother wasn't beside him. Renee hadn't known then that those words would become true in the cruelest way. And now another woman, the woman he had brought home from the rain-soaked sidewalk, had placed another dinosaur into his son's life, and his son was standing in front of him, eyes bright, saying more words than the boy had said to him in the entire past month combined. Conrad held the origami, and his eyes grew wet. He turned his face toward the window before Cash could see, and said in a voice he tried to keep normal but couldn't completely manage, "It's beautiful, son. Take good care of it." Cash laughed, truly laughed, a rare, clear sound ringing through the study, then picked up the dinosaur and ran out, leaving Conrad sitting alone, looking out at the Chicago skyline and seeing nothing at all. That evening, when Priest came to deliver the weekly report as usual, Conrad sat still and listened to everything. Then when Priest was about to stand, Conrad said, without looking at him, his voice softer than the clock on the wall, "When was the last time the boy laughed?" Priest stopped. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't remember, but because he did remember. And the answer was too long ago. So long ago that saying it aloud would turn it from a vague feeling into a truth with weight. Both men sat in silence, and in that silence, Conrad knew that the girl upstairs had done in 4 weeks what he hadn't been able to do in 4 years. She had made his son laugh. While Conrad Vale sat in silence, thinking about his son's laughter, on the other side of the city, inside a River North mansion furnished entirely in black leather and dark glass, another man was thinking about how to destroy everything Conrad was trying to hold together. Victor Salerno was 45 years old, the boss of the Salerno family, the Vale family's sworn enemy going back 2 generations, and the man Conrad suspected, but had never been able to prove, had ordered Renee shot in that parking garage 4 years earlier. Salerno wasn't like Conrad. If Conrad was steel, Salerno was acid, the kind that corroded slowly, quietly, without needing force. Only time. Salerno didn't strike head-on. He looked for cracks, then poured poison into them, and a crack had appeared. Salerno's spy network, including 2 men on the Lincoln Park security team whom he had bought long ago, reported an unusual piece of information over the past month. Conrad Vale had brought an unfamiliar young woman into the mansion to live there. Not a lover, not an escort, not an employee from any organization Salerno was watching. A complete nobody, appearing out of nowhere, and now inside the Vale boss's house day and night. Salerno didn't rush. He hired a private investigator, the kind who worked for Chicago's upper-class divorce attorneys, a man whose specialty was digging through anyone's private life down to the bone. 2 weeks later, the report lay on Salerno's desk. Finley Marsh, 27 years old. Nobody. A delivery girl, kitchen assistant, office cleaner, father dead, mother paralyzed. $94,000 in debt. Most of it in the hands of a small time loan shark named Warren Briggs. Salerno read the file, and he smiled, not with pleasure, but like a snake that had just found a hole in the chicken coop. He didn't need to know why Conrad had brought this girl into his house. He only needed to know that Conrad had done it, and that meant this girl mattered, because Conrad Vale didn't do anything that didn't matter. The call to Warren Briggs happened at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Briggs answered the phone in his old sedan, where he sat every morning eating a sandwich and making threatening calls to debtors. When the person on the other end said Salerno's name, Briggs nearly choked. "Mr. Briggs," Salerno said in a voice so polite it sounded like a dinner invitation. "I hear you're holding a debt belonging to a Miss Finley Marsh. $94,000. I'd like to buy that debt, at twice its face value." Briggs wasn't a smart man, but he was smart enough to know that when someone like Salerno offered twice the face value for the debt of a delivery girl, the only safe question was, when do you need the paperwork? The transaction was completed within 48 hours. Now, on legal paper, Finley Marsh owed Victor Salerno $94,000, and Salerno had every legal right any creditor in the state of Illinois had to collect, to sue in civil court, to request that the court freeze bank accounts. And when the debtor could no longer pay, every service being paid for with that debtor's money, including a nursing home, would be affected. Salerno didn't use guns. He used the law. The envelope arrived at the Vale mansion on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after cash had run to show Conrad the origami dinosaur. It was a black envelope, thick, with no sender's name, placed on the desk in Conrad's study by a courier Priest couldn't identify from the cameras. Conrad opened the envelope. Inside were 3 things. The first was 4 photographs of Gloria Marsh at Lakeview Nursing Home, taken from outside the window of her room, so clear that even the dirty bedsheet on Gloria's bed and the plastic flower vase on the bedside table could be seen. The second was a copy of the debt transfer agreement, showing that Finley Marsh's $94,000 debt now legally belonged to a company Conrad recognized at once as one of Salerno's shell companies. The third was a handwritten note, in Salerno's handwriting, which Conrad had seen on dozens of documents throughout 10 years of Cold War between the 2 families. "Vale, your delivery girl owes me $94,000. Illinois state law is on my side. Throw her out of your house, pull back from the Southport deal, and the debt disappears. Refuse, and I'll file a civil lawsuit on Monday. Her accounts will be frozen. The nursing home will stop taking her mother because there'll be no one left to pay. And you'll have to watch the girl you brought home like a stray dog lose the last thing she has. You know I can do it." Conrad finished reading. He set the paper down on the desk, gently, and the room went so silent that Priest, standing beside the door, heard the paper touch the wood. Then Conrad picked up the Mont Blanc pen on his desk, the pen he had used to sign every decision for the past 10 years, and snapped it in one hand. Black ink ran down his fingers, dripping onto Salerno's note, onto the photographs of Gloria, onto the copy of the contract, and Conrad looked at the ink as if he were looking at blood. Priest watched Conrad's eyes. In 12 years, Priest had learned to read Conrad's eyes the way a man reads a weather report, and what he saw now wasn't an explosive rage, wasn't panic, but something Priest feared more than anything else: calm. the particular calm Conrad only had before he became truly ruthless. Priest had seen that look only once before, the night Renee died, when Conrad stood in the parking garage staring at his wife's blood on the concrete floor, and didn't cry, didn't shout, only stood still with those eyes, then turned to Priest and said, "Find me the person who did this." Now those eyes had returned, and Priest knew that by sending this black envelope, Victor Salerno wasn't threatening Conrad Vale. He was signing his own death notice. Conrad didn't sleep that night. He didn't sleep the next night either. He sat in the basement study with Priest, and over the next 12 hours, he launched the counterattack that Priest would later call the most flawless 12 hours he had ever witnessed in his career serving the Vale family. Conrad didn't use guns. He used something far more dangerous than guns in this world: money, information, and the patience of a man who had waited 4 years to avenge his wife and had never once acted in haste. Step 1 began at 11 o'clock at night. Conrad called the Vale family's private attorney, a man whose yearly legal bill cost more than a house in the suburbs, and ordered him to establish, within that very night, a shell company registered in Delaware, the kind of corporate shell no one could trace back to its true owner. Before 4 o'clock in the morning, that company had contacted Salerno's shell company, offering to buy the entire portfolio of bad debt at 30% above market value. Finley Marsh's $94,000 debt was inside that portfolio, so small that no one in Salerno's organization bothered to inspect each individual account. They sold in bulk. By 6 o'clock in the morning, on legal paper, Finley Marsh no longer owed Victor Salerno a single cent, and Salerno didn't know it. Step 2 was the move Conrad had prepared 4 years earlier and had never used, because he had been waiting for the right moment. Since the night Renee died, Conrad had quietly built a file on every illegal operation Salerno ran. Not a police file or an FBI file because they weren't good enough, but an underworld file, the kind of evidence only insiders could gather. Priest had spent 4 years buying information from dissatisfied employees inside Salerno's organization. From frightened accountants to restaurant managers, pushed past exhaustion. Now Conrad opened the safe and took everything out. Evidence of money laundering through the chain of 7 Italian restaurants Salerno owned across Chicago. Each restaurant reporting revenue 3 times higher than reality so dirty money could be turned clean. Documents on the smuggling line moving imported goods through the South Port, where legal containers of electronics were stacked on top of cargo that never appeared on customs paperwork. And the crown jewels, 2 recordings, clear down to every breath, capturing a conversation between Salerno and 2 federal judges in the Northern District of Illinois, in which Salerno discussed the exact bribe amounts in exchange for favorable rulings in 2 lawsuits tied to West Side real estate. Those 2 recordings, if they reached the Federal Department of Justice, were enough to put Salerno in federal prison for at least 20 years, and those 2 judges would go with him. Step 3 began at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Conrad showered, shaved, put on the charcoal gray 3-piece suit he wore only for the most important occasions, and drove to Marchetti, the Italian restaurant on Elm Street in the Gold Coast where Salerno had eaten lunch every Friday for the last 15 years, the corner table by the window overlooking the street, 2 bodyguards at the next table, a bottle of Barolo red wine ordered before he even sat down. Salerno was cutting a piece of veal when Conrad walked in. He looked up, and for one flicker of a moment, something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't confidence anymore, crossed his face before he could hide it. Salerno's 2 bodyguards started to rise, but Priest was already standing by the door, arms at his sides, face without expression, and his presence alone was enough to make the 2 men sit back down. Conrad didn't wait to be invited. He pulled out the chair across from Salerno, sat down, and placed the black leather briefcase on the table beside the veal plate, gently, but with a weight they both understood wasn't only physical. "Vale," Salerno said, trying to keep his voice normal, cutting another piece of veal but not lifting it to his mouth. "I don't remember inviting you to lunch." Conrad didn't answer that. He opened the leather briefcase and took the items out one by one, placing them on the table beside Salerno's glass of Barolo, slowly, calmly, like a man dealing cards. First came the certificate for Finley Marsh's debt, stamped in red as fully paid. Salerno looked at the paper, and for the first time, the veal on his plate was forgotten. Second came the money laundering file, more than 100 pages thick, numbered and bound like a professional audit report. Third came 2 USB drives containing the judge bribery recordings, along with word-for-word transcripts. And fourth, The thing Conrad saved for last, because he wanted to see Salerno's face when he saw it, was the transfer paperwork for 3 of Salerno's largest restaurants in Chicago, the restaurants he used as the core of his money laundering network, now legally owned by a holdings corporation Conrad had created 4 months earlier, buying them one by one through third parties without Salerno knowing a thing until this exact second. Salerno stared at the stack of documents on the table. His face, flushed moments earlier from Barolo, was now as pale as the tablecloth. Conrad spoke, his voice so low only Salerno could hear, but every word was sharp as a knife. You have 48 hours to leave Chicago. Not leave the neighborhood, not leave the Gold Coast. Leave Chicago. If after 48 hours anyone in your organization, any car, any phone call, appears within a 100-mile radius of my family, I won't send these to the FBI. Conrad stopped, leaning forward, close enough that Salerno could see the veins in his eyes. I'll send them to the Bratva family in Brighton Beach, and I'll let them know who has been moving into their territory at the Southport for the past 3 years. You know how the Bratva handles territory, Salerno. They don't use lawyers. Salerno didn't say a word. He looked at Conrad, looked at Priest by the door, looked at the stack of documents on the table, then looked down at the cold veal on his plate, and he understood that he had lost, not today, but 4 years earlier, when he ordered the shooting of Conrad Vale's wife, and thought it would break him. It didn't break Conrad. It only turned him into something Salerno wasn't capable of defeating. A man with nothing left to lose who still had people to protect. Conrad stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Salerno left Chicago within 24 hours, not 48, because he had lived long enough in this world to know that when Conrad Vale gave 48 hours, he really meant 24. Finley discovered the truth on a Tuesday morning, not because anyone told her, but because she knew how to read. She was sitting in the kitchen, eating an early breakfast before Vivienne woke, scrolling through the news on the new phone Mrs. Dunn had replaced for her because the old one was too badly cracked, and on the local page of the Chicago Tribune, there was an article with a headline she read twice, then 3 times, then 4 times, and still didn't want to believe. The article talked about the underground war between organized crime families in Chicago, about the sudden disappearance of a family boss named Victor Salerno from the city, about 3 major restaurants in the Gold Coast and West Side being transferred to a mysterious corporation, and about the name mentioned again and again throughout the article, like a ghost everyone knew, but no one dared to say directly, the Vale family. The article didn't use the word Mafia, but every other word screamed it. Finley put the phone down. She looked around the kitchen, looked at the marble island where she had sat talking with Conrad at 2 o'clock in the morning, looked at the refrigerator where she took milk for Vivienne every night, looked at the high chair where Cash sat eating breakfast and showing her his newest drawing, and she saw everything exactly the same as before, and yet completely different, as if someone had just turned on the lights in a room she thought she knew by heart, and she discovered the walls weren't the color she had believed. She found Conrad in the second-floor study. He was sitting behind his desk, reading something on his laptop screen, and when she opened the door without knocking, he looked up with an expression she recognized immediately, as the expression of a man who had known this moment would come and had been counting the days. Finley didn't shout. She didn't cry. She closed the door behind her, walked to the front of his desk, set the phone down with the article on the screen facing him, and she was angry. Angry in the way only people who had been deceived by life too many times could be angry. Not loud, but very, very quiet. The Vale family, she said, her voice flat as water before a storm. Organized crime, money laundering, underground war. That's you. Conrad looked at her. He didn't deny it, didn't defend himself, didn't give her a half answer like the first time she had asked who he was. He only said, yes. Finley took a long breath, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled, not because she was afraid, but because she was holding back a fury that would burn everything between them if she let it loose. You brought me into this house without telling me where I was. You let me sleep under this roof, eat in this kitchen, care for your mother, hold your son, and never once told me that at any moment someone could come through those doors with guns. Cash is 4 years old and growing up in this house. Mrs. Vivienne is 74 and doesn't know where she is half the time. And you keep them here, in the middle of all this, because you think money and bodyguards and cameras can replace real safety. Do you have any idea what kind of danger you're putting them in? Conrad stood. He didn't step closer to her. He knew that distance was what she needed right now. but he stood because there were some things that couldn't be said sitting down. And when he spoke, Finley heard something she had never heard from him before. Not the voice of the Iron King, not the voice of negotiation, not the steel, cold voice she had grown used to. It was the voice of a man breaking from the inside. A man who had been broken for a very long time but had never allowed anyone to see it. "You think I don't know," he said, his voice low and breaking in places he couldn't control. "You think I don't live with that fear every day, every hour, every time Cash runs into the yard and I count the seconds until he comes back inside. My wife died because of this world, Finley. Renee died in an underground parking garage. 2 bullets. Less than 1 meter from my son, and my baby boy had to sit in his car seat, crying alone beside his mother's body for nearly an hour before Priest could find them." He stopped. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle twitching. "I didn't choose this life. I was born into it. And if I walk away, if I stand up and say I don't want to do it anymore, they won't let me go. They'll kill everyone I love to make sure I don't take any secrets with me. My mother, Cash." He stopped again, and this time he looked straight into her eyes, and Finley saw something in those gray eyes that she wished she hadn't seen, because it made being angry at him so much harder. "And now that includes you." The room went silent. Finley looked at him, and she saw clearly, more clearly than anything she had ever seen, that he was telling the truth. Not truth as strategy, not truth to convince her to stay, but truth in the way of a man who had kept this thing locked inside his chest for 4 years and had just opened it for the first time in front of someone he had never intended to open it to. But the truth didn't change the truth. He was Mafia. This house was a Mafia house, and her mother, Gloria, was lying in a nursing home paid for by Mafia money. If she stayed, she dragged Gloria into it. If she stayed, she accepted that her life would become tied to the world his wife had died because of. "I have to go," Finley said, and her voice wasn't angry anymore, only sad. So sad Conrad felt it in his bones. "I have my mother out there. I can't pull her into this." Conrad said nothing. He didn't hold her back, didn't make her a new offer, didn't use money or power or any of the things he had in abundance. He only stood there, watching her turn and open the door. And he didn't stop her because he knew she was right, and that was the most painful part. Finley packed her things in 15 minutes. She didn't have much. A small bag she had brought on her first day, a few sets of clothes Mrs. Dunn had bought for her, and the spare origami dinosaur she was halfway through folding for Cash. She left the unfinished origami on the bedside table, because it belonged to this house. She was pulling her bag down the stairs when she heard small feet running across the wooden floor. Fast, urgent, the footsteps of a 4-year-old child running with everything he had. Cash rushed from the hallway, holding Rex, his eyes red, and when he saw the bag in Finley's hand, his face collapsed in a way no 4-year-old should know how to collapse, because it wasn't a child's sadness. It was the grief of someone who had already learned how to lose. Cash ran to her, his small arms wrapping tightly around Finley's leg, his face pressed against her knee, and he cried, not loudly, but silently, his shoulders shaking, and he said in a choked voice Finley had to bend down to hear, "Don't go. Miss Finley, don't go. Everyone leaves." Finley knelt. She set the bag on the floor, wrapped both arms around Cash, pulled the boy against her chest, and her tears came. She couldn't stop them. She didn't want to stop them, because this 4-year-old boy was holding her with all the strength in his tiny arms, and she felt her heart break into pieces. "I'm not abandoning you," Finley whispered into Cash's hair, her voice breaking. "I promise. I'm not abandoning you." Cash lifted his head, his eyes blurred with tears, and he said in a voice that, if it could have become something physical, would have been a knife. "Mommy promised that too." Finley couldn't breathe. She held the boy a little longer, then gently loosened his hands, wiped his tears, placed Rex in his arms, and said she had to go. But she would remember him every day. She stood, picked up her bag, and when she turned back, she saw Conrad standing at the end of the hallway, his back against the wall, both hands at his sides, and he didn't try to stop her, didn't say a word, only stood there looking at her with eyes she would remember every night for many nights afterward, the eyes of a man watching something leave when he knew he had no right to keep it. Finley looked at him. Then she looked at Cash, the boy standing in the middle of the hallway, holding Rex, tears running down his cheeks but no longer making a sound, because he had learned how to cry quietly, far too young. Finley turned her back, walked out the door, and didn't look back. because if she looked back, she wouldn't be able to leave. 2 days after Finley walked out of the Lincoln Park mansion, Vivian Vale stopped eating. She didn't refuse with words. She simply sat in front of the plate Mrs. Dunn brought in and looked at it as if it were a foreign object, not understanding what it was, not understanding why it was in front of her. Mrs. Dunn tried everything. She tried the pasta Vivian had loved from 30 years earlier, tried chicken soup, tried warm milk with honey, but Vivian only turned her face toward the wall and called one name, over and over. Finley? Where is Finley? Why isn't Finley coming? Mrs. Dunn called in 3 specialized nurses, and none of them could coax her. Cash was no better. The boy stopped speaking again, stopped drawing, stopped carrying the origami dinosaur everywhere. He placed the origami beside Rex on his pillow, and lay there looking at them for hours without saying a word. And Mrs. Dunn, who had watched the boy withdraw into his shell after Renee died, recognized that he was doing it again, closing every door inside himself exactly the way his father had taught him by example. Conrad disappeared into work. He stayed in his study 18 hours a day, met with priest, made calls, handled the aftermath after Salerno left, and did everything he always did when he was in pain, which was to stop feeling and begin operating. But every night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he still went down to the kitchen, sat at the marble island, and the chair across from him was empty. On the second night after Finley left, the second floor of the mansion was silent. Mrs. Dunn had fallen asleep, exhausted after 2 days of trying to fill the hollow space Finley had left behind. The night nurse sat in the staff room, watching the cameras, and Vivienne, inside her mind, once again heard the call Alzheimer's used to lure her out of bed whenever her confusion was at its worst. The call that told her someone was waiting for her out there. But this time, it wasn't 10-year-old Conrad at Rosario. This time, it was Finley. In Vivienne's mind, Finley was somewhere in the house, maybe in the kitchen, maybe on the stairs, and she had to find her, because Finley had promised she would be here, and Vivienne remembered that promise even when she forgot everything else. She got out of bed. This time the bedroom door sensor worked, but the night nurse was in the bathroom, and in the 60 seconds between the sensor alert and the moment the nurse returned to the screen, Vivienne had already made it into the hallway. She moved faster than a 74-year-old woman should move, barefoot on the wooden floor, calling Finley's name in an urgent voice, and when she reached the top of the main staircase, the marble staircase with 17 steps leading from the second floor down to the grand foyer, she stepped onto the first stair, and her foot slipped. She fell, not slowly, but with the full weight of her body, her shoulder striking the banister, her hip twisting at an angle that 74-year-old bones couldn't bear, and she tumbled down 5 steps before her body came to a stop on the landing. Her cry of pain echoed through the silent house, and it was a sound Mrs. Dunn, jolting awake in her bed, would hear in nightmares for months afterward. Conrad arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 3:15 in the morning. The doctor said it was a femoral neck fracture, that she needed hip replacement surgery, and at 74 with Alzheimer's, the surgery carried a high risk. Conrad stood outside the recovery room, looking at his mother through the glass door. She lay on the white hospital bed, smaller than she had ever looked. Her silver hair spread across the pillow, and she wouldn't stop calling a name that wasn't his. Finley. She called for Finley again and again, her voice weak and hoarse but unceasing, and every time a nurse tried to take her hand or adjust her IV line, she jerked away. She wouldn't let anyone touch her. She only wanted Finley. Mrs. Dunn stood beside Conrad in the hallway, and she was crying, not out loud, but with tears running silently down her face, and when she looked at Conrad, he knew she was asking permission before saying the thing he didn't want to hear. "I have to call her," Mrs. Dunn said. Conrad didn't answer. He looked at his mother through the glass, looked at her trembling hands searching the hospital blanket for the hand she remembered, and he nodded once. Mrs. Dunn called Finley at 3:45 in the morning. Finley was lying on the folding bed in her room in Bridgeport, the room she had returned to after 2 nights away, and it seemed smaller, colder, emptier than she remembered, even though nothing had changed except her. She hadn't slept either night. She answered on the first ring, because some part of her had been waiting for this call without daring to admit it. When she heard Mrs. Dunn's voice, heard her crying, heard the words Vivienne, fall, broken bone, hospital, calling your name, won't let anyone touch her. Finley was dressed and out the door before Mrs. Dunn finished the sentence. She reached Northwestern Memorial at 4:20 in the morning, taking the night train and running the last 6 blocks. She didn't look at Conrad when she passed him in the hallway. She walked straight into Vivian's room, pulled a chair beside the bed, and took her hand. Vivian was calling her name in a thick, hoarse voice, and when she felt Finley's hand, the hand she recognized by touch even when her mind couldn't recognize it by logic, she stopped calling. Her eyes opened, cloudy and lost. But when they found Finley's face, something deep inside them settled, like the surface of a lake going still. "I'm here," Finley said, her voice breaking, tears falling onto Vivian's hand. "I'm here, ma'am. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I left." Vivian held her hand, so tightly that Finley felt each of the old woman's knuckles pressing into her skin. And she said nothing for a long while. She only held Finley's hand, her breathing growing steadier, the monitor beside the bed showing her heartbeat slowly coming down. Then Vivian spoke, and the voice that came from her then wasn't the voice of a woman lost to dementia, wasn't the voice of someone confusing the past with the present, but the voice of Vivian Vale, the woman who had ruled the Vale family for 40 years, lucid, clear, and painfully sharp. "Don't leave again," she said, her eyes looking straight into Finley's. And in that rare moment of clarity, they shone like the eyes of the woman who had once made the entire Chicago underworld lower its head in respect. "My boy needs you." Finley looked at her, and she didn't know whether the boy Vivian meant was Cash, the 4-year-old clutching a stuffed dinosaur and crying in the hallway, or Conrad, the 37-year-old man standing outside the glass door of the hospital room right now with red eyes he would never admit to. And maybe, Finley thought as she held Vivian's hand tighter and let the tears fall freely, maybe Vivian meant both of them. Conrad arrived at the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning, after a night in which he hadn't slept for even 1 minute. Not because of work, not because of Salerno, but because he had sat at the desk in the empty mansion and done the one thing he hadn't done in 4 years. He had thought, not with his head, but with the part of his chest he had locked shut since the night Renee died. He walked through the hallway of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, through the smell of antiseptic and the pale fluorescent lights, his Oxford shoes striking the tile floor, a thick white envelope in his hand. When he stopped outside Vivian's room, he looked in through the glass door and stood still for a very long time. Finley was dozing in the plastic chair beside Vivian's bed, her neck bent to one side at an angle that would hurt when she woke, her right hand still holding Vivian's hand on the bed, and the old woman was sleeping peacefully for the first time since she had been admitted to the hospital, because the hand she had been searching for was there. Conrad looked at the two women, one old, one young, hand in hand on the hospital bed, and he thought that he had spent his whole life protecting people with money, with power, with the fear he planted in his enemies, but he had never protected anyone in the simplest way in the world, by staying beside them. This girl did that without needing him to teach her. He opened the door, stepped in quietly, and placed the white envelope on Finley's lap. Then he stepped back beside the window and waited. Finley woke because she felt something heavy on her lap. She blinked, her neck aching, her back stiff, and her hand still holding Vivian's. She looked down and saw the white envelope, then looked up and saw Conrad standing beside the window, early light from behind him outlining the shape of his shoulders, and he was looking at her with eyes she had never seen on him before. Not cold, not guarded, not calculating, only the eyes of a man standing in front of her without any armor on. She opened the envelope with one hand, while the other still held Vivian's hand. Inside were 3 papers. The first was confirmation that the Marsh family's $94,000 debt had been paid in full, stamped in red, signed by the law firm, the words "paid in full" printed in bold at the bottom of the page. The second was an acceptance letter into the nursing program at the University of Illinois Chicago for the spring semester, with tuition for the entire program already paid, along with an enrollment confirmation. The third was a long-term care contract for Gloria Marsh at Sunrise Senior Living, one of the best care facilities in the North Shore area. A private room, a window overlooking the garden, 3 dedicated nurses, and expenses paid indefinitely. Finley's hand trembled. She read each page again, every line, every stamp, and the paper shook in her hand like a leaf in the wind. She looked up, and she wasn't crying, not yet, but her eyes were red, and her voice was only a breath. "Why?" Conrad stepped away from the window. He came to the side of her chair, and he knelt, the knees of his suit pants touching the cold hospital tile, exactly the way he had knelt on the wet sidewalk that night outside the bar, and he looked up at her from below. The most powerful man in Chicago kneeling before a delivery girl in a hospital room at 6 o'clock in the morning. And he spoke, because you ran into the street and took a beer bottle for an old woman you had never met in your life. Because you held my son when he cried at 2 o'clock in the morning and asked for nothing in return. Because you sat on the floor of my mother's bedroom all night so she could lean on your shoulder and sleep. Because you're the only person who has ever walked into my life without wanting anything from me. And Finley, that is something I can't buy with money, can't take with power, and can't threaten into existence with fear. He stopped, and his voice, the voice the entire Chicago underworld had heard like a command from heaven, was now softer than the steady monitor beside Vivian's bed. You are free, Finley. You can take these papers, walk out that door, and rebuild the life you should have had a long time ago. Your mother will be cared for no matter what you decide. The debt is gone, whether you leave or stay. The school enrollment is yours, whether you ever want to see my face again or not. You don't owe me. You never will. He looked at her, and for the first time in 4 years, Conrad Vale let someone else see everything he had hidden. The fear, the loneliness, and hope. A hope so fragile he was afraid it would break if he said it out loud. But if you choose to stay, he said, not for money, not for debt, not out of pity, but because you want to, then I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that choice. Finley looked at him. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man the world called the Iron King, the man who controlled an empire with a nod. And she didn't see those things. She saw the trembling hands on the rainy sidewalk. She saw the back of a man standing outside his son's bedroom door every night, too afraid to go in. She saw the untouched glass of whiskey in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning. She saw the red eyes outside the glass door of his mother's hospital room, the eyes he would never admit to having. Finley reached out and placed her palm against Conrad's face, gently, the calloused hand of a woman worn by 6 years of deliveries and scrubbing floors touching the cheekbone of the man all of Chicago was afraid to look straight at, and he closed his eyes when she touched him, closed them as if it was the first time in 4 years anyone had touched him with no purpose except tenderness. I'm staying, Finley said, and her voice no longer trembled. It was clear and certain, like the night she had shouted stop outside the bar. Not because you saved me, not because of the papers in this envelope, but because that night on the sidewalk, when you knelt beside your mother, your hands were shaking. The hands of a man this whole city fears were shaking because of his mother. That was when I saw you, not the boss, not the Iron King, the human being, and I'm staying for that man. On the hospital bed, Vivian Vale was asleep, her hand still holding Finley's, and the corner of her mouth, even in sleep, curved slightly upward, as though even in unconsciousness she knew the hand she had been searching for wouldn't leave again. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in December, in the kitchen of the Lincoln Park mansion where winter sunlight poured through the large windows, Vivian sat at the breakfast table drinking tea. She was having a good day, one of those days when Alzheimer's stepped back a few paces and let her see the world clearly as it was. Beside her, Finley was sitting with Cash, both of them bent over a folded sheet of paper, Finley guiding the boy through each crease of a new origami dinosaur, and Cash, the 4-year-old boy who had once been as silent as a shadow, was talking nonstop, laughing nonstop, asking Miss Finley why this one's tail was longer than the last one, why this one couldn't stand. And Finley laughed with him, fixed the folds for him, then made the dinosaur pretend to growl, making Cash laugh so hard he leaned sideways in his chair. Conrad stood leaning against the kitchen doorway, a cup of black coffee in his hand, and he was smiling. Not a polite smile, not a strategic smile, not any kind of smile he had used as a tool for the past 37 years. He smiled with his eyes, with the corner of his mouth, with his whole face, the smile of 10-year-old Conrad Vale that Vivian had always remembered, the smile he had believed had died with Renee in that underground parking garage 4 years ago. Mrs. Dunn walked past the kitchen, carrying a tray of toast, and she stopped. She looked at the scene before her. Vivian drinking tea, Cash laughing, Finley folding paper dinosaurs, Conrad smiling in the doorway, and she set the tray on the table and turned away, wiping her eyes with her hand, because she had been in this house for 20 years and had forgotten it could sound like this. Priest stood outside the kitchen door, silent, arms crossed over his chest, watching. He looked at Conrad smiling, looked at Cash talking, looked at Finley sitting among them like the missing piece this house had lacked for so long, though no one had known what shape it had until she appeared. Then Priest turned away, walked toward the front door, and said softly, not to anyone, only to himself, "About time." Vivienne set down her teacup. She looked around the table, looked at Finley, looked at Cash, looked at Conrad in the doorway, and in the final lucid moment of that morning, before Alzheimer's pulled her back into the fog, she spoke in a voice so gentle and warm and clear that everyone in the kitchen heard it. "Our house has laughter again." And that is the story of a delivery girl who had nothing but an old bicycle and a heart that refused to give up. A powerful boss who had forgotten how to love. An old woman losing her memories but never forgetting how to find her way back to the people she loved. And a 4-year-old boy who only needed one grown-up to keep the promise to stay. This story isn't a fairy tale. It happens every day around us. On sidewalks where people walk past without stopping. In nursing homes where children try to pay every dollar to keep their parents somewhere decent. In kitchens at 2 o'clock in the morning where two lonely people find each other. The greatest lesson this story leaves behind isn't about romantic love, but about the value of kindness when no one is watching. Finley didn't run out to take that beer bottle because she knew who Vivienne was. She did it because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes, one right act from an ordinary person can change an entire world. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that sometimes the people who have nothing are the very ones who give the most, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories. We would love to hear how you feel, what this story brought up for you, whether it reminded you of someone in your own life, whether there was a moment that brought tears to your eyes. Please write it in the comments below, because every line you share from deep inside your heart is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling stories like this. We say goodbye for now, and thank you for staying with us until the very last minute. May you and your family always be healthy, and may your life be joyful and peaceful every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.